Just give me a second.
Hello, Ben.
Okay. So hello family to the 16th session of FDG. This is the penultimate session of Series 1. Series 2 will start in mid-August this year and will continue for about 8 months till April of 2022. So there'll be a break of about 4 months after this last session on the 18th. The resurgent private sector. I believe this sector has been vibrant globally for many decades and has flourished under many different political dispensations, democracies, dictatorships, autocracies, plutocracies. We in India stayed socialist and centrally planned for 40 years after independence. And while some dismantling began in 1991, vestiges still abundantly remain. The public sector still runs loss-making enterprises like hotels, airlines, telecoms, and much, much more. But we are now respectable and we are wealth creators. The chains are coming off, although a little late. And again, due to an economic crisis, as was the case in 1991. I think that is one of the major reasons for the chains coming off this time around as well. But of course, I didn't know all of this at the age of 20 when I needed a job. Government jobs were the norm in those days in the family, emphatically, but I didn't want one. Under family pressure, I started the UPSC process for the central services as I was too young for the All India services, chose ridiculous subjects for the 3 optional papers like mercantile law, British constitutional history, and something else I don't remember now. Subjects I had zero knowledge of. Did not prepare, or just sat for the exam, lost my roll number, moved to Bombay to Munni Buaji, stayed with her, started working, didn't check the results when they were declared. And then a telegram was received in Delhi, bombshell. Ranu had qualified for the interview. Shock all around. This is how the UPSC interview went. Mr. Das, why do you want to work for the government? You're already working and earning more than what the government would pay you. Sir, respectfully, I don't. Why are you here? Because my father wanted me to be here. What followed was that the conversation was conveyed to my father by a well-known gentleman who happened to be on the interview panel and was a friend of my father, a fact I was not aware of. I was put in front of Bade Tauji promptly, head of the Das clan. Maybe he was the chief secretary of UP, I don't know at the time. I guess my father didn't want to face the music himself, so I was the sacrificial lamb. I don't remember Tauji's exact words, but the message was this. Kyun barkhurdar? Tel bechoge ya sabun? I guess he must have accepted the inevitable when his own grandson, the leader of today's session, joined the private sector also. Okay. But I was the black sheep of the family, the first who willingly chose private over public service. Many have followed, and today I think no youngster in the family chooses public over private. And it isn't the money. It's the fun, the excitement of achievement followed by reward, the meritocracy, especially as an entrepreneur. There are risks and failures, but these are the essential ingredients of success. I have been called a serial entrepreneur by many and wouldn't have it any other way. I have walked through snake-infested rainforests, journeyed in a small canoe in crocodile-infested rivers, flown in the Concorde several times, by the way, at Mach 2.4, conducted business with all major nationalities globally, created projects in 25 countries, developed close friendships from the US to Korea and every country in between, and much more, all in the line of business. Thank goodness for my decision at age 20. Almost everyone disagreed with it at the time. But let's hear from the four speakers today, three of whom have made their mark in the private sector and one who has dealt extensively with the private sector while being in the public sector. They are Chand, IIT Kanpur, IIM Ahmedabad is a former CEO and co-founder of ITC Classmate. He is an angel investor, coach, and mentor for startups, social enterprises, and family businesses. He enjoys traveling, yoga, OTT, and listening to music and podcasts. Chand is the senior-most Gen 3 member of this clan and the leader in today's session. And by the way, he insisted that this was a short intro only, which is what I have done for now for everybody. Gautam is MBA, University of Chicago, is the founder and managing partner of Pegasus 7 Ventures, a venture capital fund. He was formerly an investment banker for 20 years and has worked across the US, Europe, and Asia. He was previously managing director, head of Asia Pacific Telecom and Media, and Southeast Asia TMT at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Madhu, St. Stephen's, Delhi School of Economics, was a commercial banker for almost 4 decades with an insider's experience of several geographies, including India and China. He currently takes up arbitration cases and consults for UNDP. He writes a monthly column on the wayward behavior of the real-life economy, the economic reality, and book reviews. He enjoys golf and reading and listening to music. Harish spent the best part of 3 decades in the corporate sector, working across several sectors and functions. He has spent over 10 years in the private education space with a focus on EdTech, school education, and vocational education. Harish has since crossed over to the nonprofit sector and is presently director at the Central Square Foundation and on the trustee board of 2 other NGOs. The speakers today are all from Gen 3 and all male. And all are professionally active in very diverse fields. So to take it forward, Chand, over to you.
Great. So thank you, Ranu Chacha, for that eclectic introduction. And welcome to all the participants today. So the trigger today for today's session really was that, when Nirmala Sitharaman announced her budget on the 1st of February, there were a lot of incentives that were provided to the private sector. And shortly thereafter, when the Prime Minister spoke in the Lok Sabha, he talked about, privatization in a very positive way. Up to now, privatization was certainly accepted, encouraged, but it somewhere was still a dirty word. I think some of that is now sought to be changed. And also, he made a comment saying that, babus shouldn't be running businesses. Apologies to some babus who are on this panel, but that's the language the Prime Minister used as well. And small examples, very recently, just I think a couple of days ago, there's a lady from Chennai called Malika Srinivasan. She was appointed as the chairperson of the Public Enterprises Selection Board. So she's going to be chairing a committee which hires CEOs for the public sector. And for the first time, that position has been given to somebody from the private sector. Hitherto, it was always held by a bureaucrat or a retired bureaucrat. So small things, but I think there is enough messaging that is coming through now on support to the private sector, especially as we now go into the next decade. We are now in 2021, and in many ways, this could well be a golden decade for India. And that's what we are going to be talking about over the next hour or so. So let me just begin by introducing, or rather connecting a few dots from the recent pronouncements that have been made across multiple sectors. So if we look at it in the traditional way, in agriculture, we are all aware that the farm laws got announced and there was a huge backlash. Now, without going deeply into the merits of the farm laws, I would only like to say that the intent of the farm laws was great, in the sense that it sought to give the farmers multiple options and not just get restricted to selling to the mandi. It's also a very strong message in terms of creating what is called a demand-driven supply chain, as against supply-led agriculture system. Now, I worked in companies like ITC, and I'd just like to share a few examples. All of us are using Ashirvad Atta at our homes. And just to let you know that ITC many years ago started procuring wheat directly from farmers through their e-Chaupal network. And, that then got processed by a lot of third-party outsourcing millers. And finally, the branding and distribution happens through ITC, and it is made available in about 2 million grocery stores across the country. So the point is, in a demand-driven supply chain, you need to be able to pull, farm output from the farm all the way to the table. Another great example is Amul, which, went the cooperative route. And we all know how Amul is catering to millions of dairy farmers who, through a hub and spoke arrangement, are, supplying milk, and the Amul dairies are processing that into butter, cheese, ice cream, and a whole lot of products that all of us are consuming. Even some startups in agri are sort of doing this. There are a number of startups. There's an example of a startup called Ninja Cart. It sources fresh fruits and vegetables and supplies them to small hotels, restaurants, and cafes in and around Bangalore. And there are several others similarly. There's a startup in which I have invested, and I sort of work with them very closely, where they have got 10,000 farmers to plant bamboo, which is a grass. It's an agri product. And they are converting that bamboo into furniture for IKEA. So the point I'm trying to make is that creating a demand-driven supply chain for agri produce is something that is well-intentioned. I must also say that in the last couple of days, the government has also announced a huge production-linked incentive system for food processing industries. What does that mean? That means that the more the food processing industries invest in capital investments and in market development, the backward linkage with agri produce gets stronger. We actually begin then to start exporting a lot of agri-based processed products. And today, all the private sector companies in food processing have really welcomed this move. And it could be, again, a game changer in terms of what I talked about, a demand-driven supply chain. So that's a little story on agri. Moving forward into manufacturing, there are several little things that have been announced. Many of you may be aware but India has a 15% corporate tax for new manufacturing units. It's amongst the lowest in the world. The idea is to encourage manufacturing. And you know that after the Ladakh skirmish with China, there is now a move to create an alternative supply chain, which is less dependent on China. And thanks to some political alignments such as Quad, which is the US, Australia, Japan, and India, India is being seen as a potential factory for Quad, right? Which is a great thing because there'll be more and more sourcing from the Quad countries as we start setting up capability within India. Production-linked incentives have been massively announced and implemented in manufacturing. Let me give you an example of mobile phones. Today, the leading 22 mobile phone manufacturers in the world are all setting up shop in India. As we speak, Apple phones are being produced, Samsung phones are being produced. The Chinese phones are setting up manufacturing capability. So 22 mobile phone manufacturers are going to be producing mobile phones worth $250 billion, some of it for export and a large percentage for the Indian market. And this is happening in other categories like pharma, like solar panels and various other such categories where the incentive structure is massive to drive investment. The government has spoken very strongly about disinvestment of PSUs, opening up defense production, space, remote sensing, areas which were really closed and were, let's say, holy cows of the government have been opened up to the private sector. The national infrastructure pipeline, which the government is now implementing very strongly, is going to drive demand for steel, cement, and a whole lot of other construction-related inputs. And we know that even in the COVID situation, I mean, it's crazy. When COVID hit India, there was not a single manufacturer of PPE, these protection kits in India. And suddenly, in a 6-month period, we were able to start from zero and set up capacity to make 1 million PPE kits a day. And today, we are net exporters of PPE kits. Same story for ventilators. We are all in the middle of the pandemic. India's vaccine output is getting ramped up massively. And, syringe cap capacities. So all of these are going all over the world. There are about 40 countries which are receiving our manufactured products. So the idea, therefore, is to just, give you a feel that in manufacturing, a lot of things are getting unleashed as we speak. And some of us may not, visualize the enormity of what's going on. But I just thought I would help connect some of those dots. Coming to services, there are going to be more global delivery centers coming up, especially in and around Bangalore. All the Fortune 500 companies sitting in the US have plans to put in a global delivery center. They're either already here or planning to put it here. And there's a big boom in e-commerce, also fueled by the pandemic. So the big giants like Amazon and Walmart are already here. JioMart, EdTech companies, Byju's, we are seeing it so much on television. Many of you may not know that Byju's is today the most valuable education company in the world. And that's quite amazing. We're going to speak a little more about it later. There are a host of e-commerce startups which have sprung up, and many of them are getting rapid traction. In our own family, we've got cases of Greendigo run by Barkha. We have Tarini running her startup. We have Rashmi running hers on Anthea with soaps. And of course, Jayant is involved in media analytics through Meltwater. I think Shivani, Veer's wife, is also running hers. And I find that in all these startups, there has been better traction during this pandemic period. And I think there are many more good things to come as we proceed. There's lots of action happening in banking and financial services. There's a lot of talk of privatization, increasing FDI, allowing government to access private sector banks, setting up of a bad bank, development financial institutions. FII flows have been massively buoyant in the last 12 months. We are up about 40% over the previous year. And there's a vibrant startup ecosystem developing where today India has created 40 what we call unicorn. A unicorn is a startup with a value of $1 billion. So $40 billion worth of startups. And remember, globally, there are about 600 unicorns. India contributes about 15% of those, which is not bad. And there is a big move to grow this number as we move forward. So I can actually go on and on, but what I would like to do is to say that to stop at this point, having sort of introduced the subject, I'd also like to point out, to some cautions. While the picture looks very rosy from what I just spoke about, the cautions, of course, are that we are in the throes of a COVID second wave, and that is a bit of a dampener. But if you see everybody who knows the subject is talking about, the intensity of infection being lower and the severity being lower, and hopefully with the vaccination drive that is going on in India. Yesterday, we did nearly 4 million vaccinations in a day. And going forward, starting tomorrow, we should be hitting 5 million a day consistently. And that should, I think, help to some extent. The fiscal challenges are there. States are a bit fiscally challenged. So the question is, will the programs and the incentives that have got announced get actually implemented on the ground? So anyway, those are the usual cautions, and they are the usual questions that will come up. But to debate some of these issues, what we've done today is to assemble an interesting group of panelists who've got great experience in the private sector, and in Madhu's case, in public sector banks working closely with the private sector. So what I'm going to do is to be working with all the panelists in a kind of a question and answer format. I'm going to be asking a few questions of them. And then I'm also going to be asking the audience about their comments and their views. So it's going to be a little more interactive, more like a talk show or a fireside chat that we're going to have today. There are no presentations as such that we have planned. It's going to be so the format is what it is. A special mention of our two sons-in-laws, Ranganathan and Doraiswamy. That sounds like a firm of chartered accountants in Chennai or a coaching center for civil servant aspirants in Delhi. So they're going to make, I think Doraiswamy is going to make his debut on FDG with this session, right? Okay, so let me get started with a couple of questions, and my first question will go to Madhu. He's my brother-in-law, and I'm going to ask him about his views. So Madhu, as someone who's seen the BFSI sector up close and has held very senior positions in policy making, I wanted your views on creation of some of these new institutions that have been spoken about. So a bad bank. I mean, what's the good thing about a bad bank? And a DFI, a development financial institution, and how these institutions like this might make a big difference. So Madhu, like to hear from you.
Hi, Chang. Hi.
Madhu, you're on mute. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Now, good. Yeah. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. See, the question you've asked me is, will they make a difference? One, intent is good, and there's nothing wrong in the concept of for DFI. In fact, I was campaigning it for it when I was in service. and we need DFIs because DFIs can absorb risk better being sovereign. And a bad bank to aggregate bad assets is always a good idea. And we have several bad banks, but they're all small in size. And the problem in India is somewhat different from what the model of the Indian small bad banks, ARCs, was geared for. The ARC model came in India sometime about 10 years, 12 years back. It was a cut and paste from the US model. In US, this model developed in the 1990s when the Small Savings and Loan Association crisis hit US. About 2,000 odd saving and loan associations had collapsed on account of NPAs during the Reagan, post-Reagan liberalization of late 80s, early 90s. So then the type of NPAs then were small corporates, and ARCs had come up and they used to buy up these and restructure them and sell them off or strip their assets and put them back into working. So that model was copied here. The Indian NPA situation which emerged in the last 10 years is however different. One interesting aspect of the Indian NPA system is that RBI till now has not revealed the structure of the Indian NPAs, the sectoral NPAs. This is very unusual. 10 years into the NPA crisis, you don't know this. The fact of the matter is that bulk of the NPAs are so-called PPP projects of various dimensions.
Interesting.
These are highway projects, port projects, steel plants, power plants. These are erstwhile public sector, government, sovereign districts, which were put into PPP. But because the construction of the contracts, the way the contracts were drafted was very ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations, after a few years, you had a huge amount of problems, and you had the so-called mining scam and telecom scam and mining ban and all those things happened. And plants and projects which were put up in good faith because of PPP collapsed. And resolution was not easy. They tried a resolution through this so-called, what do you call, insolvency bill.
Yeah.
And they thought that they'll get the insolvency thing cleared up in 6 months, 9 months, but in US, it happens very fast.
So will a bad bank sort of enable commercial banks to focus on their business, and then the bad bank guys
I'll come to that.
will then focus on recoveries? I just wanted you to have a
I'll come
quick
to
word,
that.
because I have to move on to some of the other panelists.
Yeah, I'll come to that.
Yeah.
Now, everything depends on the intent and the nature of the problem.
Mhm.
You know, you can have a very good concept and you can say nice things, but if you don't practice what you preach, it doesn't work. Now,
Okay.
the problem with the Indian public sector banking, at least the financial sector, is that it is governed by too much amount of backseat driving.
Oh,
And that
okay.
backseat driving takes place by multiple regulators. You know,
Right.
we have all read about Vikramaditya, the King Vikramaditya, and the Betal jokes. And Betal sitting on Vikramaditya. The Indian BFSI structure, especially the public, has got two Betals. One is a regulator, RBI, which should act as a regulator, but acts like a quasi-owner cum regulator. And one is the government, the Department of Banking Services, which also acts. And these two Betals also don't get along well. So you're saddled with these two Betals, often fighting with each other and backseat driving everything. Now, if you have a DFI, which is backseat driven, or if you have a bank, which is backseat driven, and multiple people squabbling with each other, things will go on in the same way as they are going on.
Okay, and Madhu. So
change.
Let me come back to you a little more on some related questions. I want to now go across to Singapore, to Gautam. So Gautam, sitting where you are, you know, with an outside-in view, my question to you is that how do foreign investors perceive the new thrust on privatization, and talk a little bit about private capital and its potential and what it can do for India and why it will come to India. Gautam?
Yeah, so thanks Chandaya for that, and hi everyone. So I'll tackle your question by starting off on a slightly different outside-in view about my views on private capital. Right, I think private capital, by its very nature, is destined to be deployed. right? It is meant to be deployed. It is meant to earn a return for the owners of that capital, and it's hungry for opportunities. So I think if the opportunity is there, there is a certain framework, including an opportunity for a certain hurdle rate of return and the right policy framework, private capital will come, right? They're always seeking areas to deploy globally, whether it's emerging markets or frontier markets. And I think one can look at how private capital has really benefited innovation globally, right? We look at, I'll give some examples of, very early Amazon, very early Google, right? These were moonshots at that point in time, or an Apple. They drive growth and scale, globalization, taking risk and backing risk, right? That's where private capital comes in. There are also various pools of private capital. There are the standard public markets, which you're very familiar with. But a bit earlier in that frame is private equity, which backs companies which are not ready to be listed and are not seasoned enough for the public markets. And very early is venture capital, which you alluded to, right? And these are companies which no one backs unless it's risk capital ready to back them. And if you look at our current behavior around how we travel now, whether it's an Uber or an Ola, or how we shop online, and how we maybe learn online, or how we order food online. I mean, all of this came from companies which are still not profitable, right? Now, the essence of private capital is it will go where it is welcome, right? So there are issues where and reasons where it will not go somewhere. So, for example, and in a certain way, India comes up on top on certain issues, which is there a sanctity of contract? Is there a rule of law? Is there predictability of the policy framework? Is there adequate scope for return, which is less so because private capital will find a way to make a return? Are there adequate exits? Is there ease of doing business? Right? All of these are very important factors because global capital flows like water, right? They can go anywhere in the world they want to. And they choose to go into jurisdictions where, of course, return and risk has to be balanced out, but there are certain areas where they will not want to get stuck, and certain geographies. And I think in a certain way, coming to India, there is good news and bad news from my perspective. I think just by switching on a button and saying, okay, now we are privatizing, and now we've opened up these sectors and expecting the floodgates to open, ain't going to happen. Hasn't happened in the past, is not going to happen now, in my view. I think what needs to happen is a policy which, one could also look at China, for example, for, backing commerce with a strategic intent, right? So what happens in China when they decide to back certain sectors, they go for growth, they go for scale, they go for very tariff-friendly policies, and they will also close off the local market for a company to develop scale and global economies of scale. So there is no Google, no Facebook, no Amazon in China, right? But there is a Alibaba, there is a JD.com, there is a Tencent, there is a Baidu. And all of these are companies which benefit a billion plus population, and these companies deserve the scale from a billion plus population. In India, we don't have global scale companies in the digital sector, right? One of the reasons for that is we were very open early on. We didn't back the company with strategic intent. We let anyone come in and take stakes. But I think I digress, and I'll talk about this in the venture capital and the digital aspect. But back to my point about foreign investment and recent policy changes. There are two aspects I want to also reiterate. India is currently fighting two global companies in global courts around sanctity of contract, rule of law, predictability, retroactive tax laws. These are, cases with Vodafone in the UK, Cairn in the UK. There was a very similar case with Docomo in Japan, which was against Tatas and not the government of India. But that also was a very, very messy corporate situation which got resolved when the change of guard happened at the Tata Group. But if in 2012, the retroactive tax laws came into play forever by the then finance minister, and the battle was won in the Indian courts, but then it went to arbitration in Singapore, then it went to arbitration in The Hague, and it's still not being honored, and a company is going after state sovereign assets. I think these are, examples, but they attract too much negative attention.
Got it. I think, yeah.
And that's
Gautam, I'm going to come back to you again because we want to keep the conversation moving on different aspects. Harish, over to you now. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has given a lot of fillip to the digital world, so to speak, whether it's e-commerce, whether it is education, even healthcare. And, I wanted your take on what's going to happen. We keep hearing that if companies don't go digital, they're going to die or they're going to be less effective than those companies who are embracing digital. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Thank you, John Bhai Sahab. Good evening to the Das clan in India and good morning to those on the East Coast. I think the specific answer to your question is a yes. There is enough reason for us to be optimistic about the future, but it's a kind of a qualified yes, because we've had a fairly special situation in the past year, and COVID has basically raised all boats, and everybody is looking good. And when that tide recedes, there will be some people left without clothes, doubtless. So it's good to be optimistic, but we cannot say that each one of the players who are benefiting from the rising COVID tide will be here to stay and profit and benefit. But also, I think COVID and the pandemic have affected different sectors differently. For instance, I mean, hardcore brick and mortar sectors like education and healthcare are completely ravaged. People are not visiting for OPD, people are postponing their operations and procedures in hospitals, and revenues in hospitals have suffered. Same with private schools, which is a big thing in India. Most private schools haven't even managed to collect 50% of their fees for last year. So they're not able to pay teachers' salaries, never mind paying the tech companies that supported them through this pandemic. So, but in the case of EdTech, what has happened is that there's been a big user growth, a lot of it free, non-paying, non-premium customers, basically doing Zoom calls. And valuations have gone up, usership have gone up in the case of EdTech. In the case of health tech, which is not healthcare, but technology that helps healthcare, like online consultations and all of those kind of things. Those kind of businesses have seen both user and revenue growth, as well as a lot of investor interest. And then you have e-commerce, which has also been a beneficiary because all of us have shifted so much of our shopping online. So clearly it has benefited in these sectors. But one must remember that this in a country like India, it has basically benefited the top 20% of population at best. And the digital divide is there for real. And while all of us and our children have been studying online, we've been taking online courses, meeting our doctors online, shopping online, the poor in India, which a substantial number, haven't had that privilege. So what we see is that while this has been divided, there's been a sharp difference in how the top end has been catered to and the bottom end has been catered to. But it is very interesting to see how everybody is making an effort, even with a standing start like the government, to embrace technology. I am pleasantly surprised to see a lot of babus doing so many video calls and happy to do video calls now compared to what the situation was a year ago. In education, state governments have taken the help of WhatsApp, and currently WhatsApp is what is fueling school education. It's a totally different matter as to whether learning genuinely happens on WhatsApp and smartphone screens. But the reality is that is the only way to provide access to millions of children in India. I'll give you an example. There is a company called Convigenius, which does free weekly assessments for kids in government schools. They've gone from a standing start, 0 customers, not even an idea of of their product in April of 2020, to having 8 million kids take a weekly test, letting teachers know whether they are learning or not. So 8 million kids is a fair number, and probably more than the student population of many countries. So even adults, I know Rahul Bhaiya and many others have been taking online courses as well. Rural e-commerce, for instance, has gained big traction. Vernacular, people who are uncomfortable placing orders in English on websites are now able to do that in the vernacular, and chatbots are translating these orders into the system, and these are getting serviced. So these
That's
are
very interesting. So, one of the startups that I recently invested in is called Nikki.ai. What it's doing is that it is working in tier 2 and tier 3 on an e-commerce platform with a voice assist where it operates in Hindi, and it is available. It's tested in Rajasthan in 190 towns. Amazon and Flipkart are servicing only 4 out of the 190. So the next billion or the next $500 million that you spoke about, I think there are huge fertile opportunities there for e-commerce companies to go down that road and build a credible position with these kind of consumers. So thank you, Harish, for that. Gautam, I'm going to come back to you as a follow-up. So the inevitable question is that, I spoke a little bit about how we are trying to create an alternate supply chain to China. Now, is that something that you see happening? And sitting where you are, we are also competing with other ASEAN countries. I mean, Vietnam comes up, even Bangladesh comes up in discussion. So how do you see supply chains shifting?
Yeah, so I think the one thing which is pretty clear is the polarization of China across pretty much ASEAN, South Asia, and the West to a certain extent. But this is not anything new. So when China started messing around in the South China Sea, which has been always the case, but they turned up the heat. I think Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore got their act together very quickly. So manufacturing started shifting, and I would point out Vietnam was one of the leaders in taking advantage of this. 100 million plus population, they have the ability to take that advantage. Went ahead very quickly, and then to a lesser extent, Indonesia and Singapore. But I think that advantage which a country like Vietnam took on very early, and again, this was backed by the government with strategic intent, right, to lure them away. So I think now from an India perspective, I think the fundamental challenges which have refrained manufacturing from get to the percentage of GDP it needs to be at, needs to be resolved, right? And the question I have is, are these just statements? Because why do we always talk back about 1991 when we talk about major reforms, right? We are now sitting in 2021, but we always go back to 1991. So I think the proof is going to be in the execution, right? And it's a two-way street. Just saying I will sort out this and expect people to come is not going to work. There has to be strategic intent. If someone is putting $1 billion in, he has to be protected for a certain period with tariffs. If some other country puts tariffs in, or the Indian government puts tariffs in, I think the opportunity is there, but it's about strategic intent of the government. It's about the pace. I think the intensity and the urgency of how quickly to capture this window of opportunity is a question mark for me, because this needs to move very quickly on the side. And then manufacturing is the law of physics. It takes time, right?
Absolutely. I think that's well said. Harish, I'm going to come back to you. Madhu spoke a little while ago about, NPAs getting created, and the PPP model, the public-private partnership model, in its earlier avatar, perhaps was a cause for NPAization. Now, going forward with what's happening, let's say, on in sectors of infrastructure or even education or healthcare, how do you see PPP moving forward in a better or in a more effective avatar?
That's a tough one because in theory, everything is right about PPPs, right? There is a efficient private sector. There is a, in some cases, a deficient public sector, but with assets and rights. And these two come together to provide better quality and service to customers. So theoretically, it's all good. In practice, of course, whether now or whether 20 years back, it is roughly the same machinery that is running these PPPs, entering into 30, 40, 50-year contracts, which are typically one-sided, which are tough to get out of. And that is why we see the kind of problems that we see in, take the Delhi-Noida highway, take the Delhi-Gurgaon highway. Both sides are PPPs. Take the Reliance Energy or Anil Ambani Group run Airport Express. All of these in Delhi, we've seen spectacular blowouts. So the challenge in this is that I think that we need two really wise parties to come together, well-funded. Not for nothing is the PPP always is also derisively known as politician proprietor partnership.
Yeah.
Because there is so much of this match fixing going on. So, I mean, if the biggest challenge in PPPs is unforeseen circumstances, you enter into 20, 30, 40-year contracts. While, you endeavor to put everything into the contract, every foreseeable situation, but unforeseen things like the pandemic happens, right? What happens when things like this happen? Or, for instance, the court cancels mining licenses, the Supreme Court, where there is no regulatory certainty. I think if we need PPPs, and the government has indicated over the past few years, certainly the past few months, that it is very keen for PPPs across sectors, and especially in education and healthcare. Also, they have been mentioning. One must remember that all the PPPs that we've got off the ground in India, most of them happen in the hard infrastructure, economic infra space, and not in the social infra space. And in the social infra space, I feel that a lot of the cases, state governments are involved, and the state, the center, individual parties coming together to sign really sensible contracts which are open to negotiation at some point in time. It can't be that, I can't negotiate if things go wrong and you go to court and the court orders something which, causes the kind of NPAs that Bhai Sahab said. So I feel that there is a potential for PPPs, provided there is a mindset to run them for their lifetime and not run them into the ground.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to go back to Madhu and talk a little bit about something that's, very much in the media, which is the privatization of two public sector banks, one general insurance company, and divestment in LIC. We see a lot of LIC advertising these days. I think part of it is driven towards, the public to pick up shares whenever it sort of divests. So, Madhu, are these, what is all this about? Is it symbolism? Is it really that, private capital will turn things differently? How do you see it?
See, the governing motive is something which is often termed as called fiscal dominance. The priority given to resolving fiscal problems and using any method to solve the fiscal distress. And stake sale like an LIC, what will be sold off is about 25% share, and by way of an IPO or there to get additional funds coming into the government kitty. It will not change the management of LIC. So it will remain safe with some private shareholding, and the government kitty will be bolstered by the 25% slotting.
Mhm.
Selling of banks is a different thing. When they are saying they will privatize banks, the Indian public sector bank does various things other than banking. It does a lot of social activities, You give loans to persons who are not otherwise merit a loan, who don't have any collaterals, but you give it because you're a government bank. You give loans to enterprises which are not on commercial terms, but only because they're MSMEs and they need to be supported. You do agri funding. So all that will stop. If you are a private sector, the focus of a private sector is to make money for yourself and for your stakeholders. The focus of a public sector is to please the political masters. So if you are happy with two banks stopping pleasing you and you stop disturbing them henceforth, things might, but will you give it up? And if you don't give it up, you'll have a mess later on.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it depends on the intent. And the intent, I think, is missing. When the Prime Minister has been saying a lot of positive things. But if you remember when he came in 7 years back, he said minimal government and maximal governance. If you look at the Indian administrative structure today, we have got the maximum number of ministries and secretaries and secretariats compared to any other country, including China. We've got 70, 80, 90 ministers there, and each of has a secretary or two secretaries or three secretaries, each of whom has. And all those people have to justify their presence. And they justify themselves by intervening in the economic fora, by passing rules or passing regulations or inventing or reinventing things or suggesting. And that is what is the problem. And no one has despite 7 years, not a single department has been wound up, not a single activity has been shut. In 1991, within 3 months, several government activities were shut down and cancelled. That was the greatness of the liberalization. The government withdrew its hands completely and absolutely from activities. That has not happened in the last 7 years.
Right.
If it happens, then there might be a positive impact. If it does not happen, we'll have more of the same thing and you'll have further messes down the line.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Back to you, Harish. There were some questions in the chat box, which I'm not really addressing as of now, but I'm trying to weave in some of those concerns. So the question to you is that, the non-profit sector, or NGOs, as we popularly call them, how can they work with, as private players to transform underserved consumers, and whether it's education or healthcare or even infra, is there some admission that the government is failing to deliver, or and therefore we need alternate mechanisms? So your thoughts, please.
I mean, first off, the NGO sector. I think the total budget of all NGOs in India is about 70,000 crores, right? Now, for us as individuals, that might look like an awful lot of money. But the reality is it is 1/10 of what our education sector is, public plus private put together, right? So if we are looking for the NGO sector to save us, then we are probably looking in the wrong direction. One. Two is that there are things that the NGO sector can offer in terms of creating new models for more efficient delivery, trying to make the government systems more efficient, trying to advise the government on various things, acting like the eyes and ears of the government. They can fill in gaps, right? But they can't provide the full cake, right? So I think NGOs have a role, but NGOs have to be allowed to thrive. Today, what has happened is the life has been sucked out of NGOs by the new FCRA rules, which restrict foreign donations, not eliminate, but restrict. And also this PM Cares Fund, which was launched as a response to COVID, which is basically sucked out all domestic CSR money right now. So NGOs are in a really tough spot. They're trying their best, but 3-4 more years of this, and you will see, blood on the NGO streets.
Very interesting.
The On the other hand, I think we are looking at the private sector to essentially solve public goods and services issues, right? And that is, I think private sector is brilliant at providing private goods, which is, there are many economists on this, which would be defined as a non-exclusive, non-rival goods, right? Or rival and exclusive goods, sorry. So that's what the private sector does. But when you have public services, social sector services to be provided by the private sector is usually poor at it. The public sector does not, there are cost restrictions, the cost takeout is low. So private sector can't usually solve the problems of this of this size. It is for the government to actually do this. And that's where I think some of the worries for me lie. For instance, we did a national education policy just a few months ago, which advocated something which had been advocated in 1968, which is to double our spend on education. What did we do in the budget? We actually reduced our education spend in the current budget. So the reality is that I think that the private sector will come in if there are basic services being provided and basic healthcare, education, sanitation, water. All of these hard problems are for the government to solve, and the private sector can come and assist maybe, but can't solve these problems. These hard public sector problems needs to be solved by a capable and well-capacitized government, which we don't see, certainly many times, even down to the state level and the municipality level. We don't see that very often. So
okay, thanks for that, Harish. I'm going to go back to Singapore, to Gautam, for some comments on what's going to be attracting, what does India need to do to attract more private capital in terms of private equity, venture capital, and for enhancing success outcomes. So quickly, if you could share that, because after that, I'm going to really open it up to a lot of others. There are lots of questions coming on the chat box, and I'm going to ask the questioners to articulate some of these themselves. Okay, so Gautam, your take on improving outcomes?
Yeah, look, I think like anything in India, right, there's no straight answer, right? So I think the positives are, if you look at the venture capital space, right, there is a significant amount of capital which is coming into India. And that is because it is probably the best in terms of the regulatory framework. It is not mapped out by existing public sector, government, or entrenched private sector, right? The speed and the intensity of the capital getting deployed and execution is very different. So if you look at what's happened in a very short time space of 5-6 years, you look at the reinforced sectors through COVID, which is transport, food delivery, e-commerce. It's been fantastic in terms of the adoption and the usage. And if you look at the sectors which are coming up, more frontier like ed tech, health tech, I think they'll also start doing better in terms of adoption and penetration. But the capital is there, right? Harish alluded to the digital divide. It's real, it's there. Look at the smartphone penetration. It's still less than 50%, poor versus China. So there are challenges, right, for it to get to the right penetration role in. My fund has invested in two companies, and I work closely with them as a board member. One is a health tech and insurance play, which is not in India but in Southeast Asia, but affordable, right? We charge people from the mobile phone bill, for example, to solve for the payment issue. But we've seen a phenomenal spurt in telehealth because of what happened last year and is ongoing right now. And that is an adoption which we couldn't have catalyzed even if we wanted to over the next 5 years. The other company is a company called Stalking. It does rural commerce in India. Digitizes mom and pop kiranas in tier 3 to tier 7, right? Starts from district headquarters. We're seeing very encouraging trends there. Of course, just the logistics and the supply chain to tier 6, tier 7 towns is broken. We have to do it ourselves. but the ability of Kiranas to come up to speed on digital and transacting on tablets and smartphones has been very encouraging. I think on the private equity side, also you see pockets. You see real estate being very attractive in India. GIC, Temasek, the big guys, Blackstone are all there, probably the largest owners of real estate in India. You're seeing a lot of encouraging moves in energy, right? But I think these are all pockets, right? We are nowhere where we should be on manufacturing. And let's go back to the Make in India comment from 5-6 years back. Or the I think the core area where we need to provide employment, we need to provide the skills and the reskilling. I think that's where we are falling behind. And if we can't sort that out, I don't think we can move this population size to security and stability, right? We'll continue to talk about the top 10 20% of the population, and all Amazon, Flipkart, all the names I'm taking right now, all of these guys are focused on the top 20-25%. The battle hasn't yet gone down below, and it's the hardest to mine the next billion. It's the hardest to mine profitably and to get to them in an affordable manner, and I see that firsthand from my fund.
Okay, great, thanks for that. I'm going to open it up to other people in the audience now. Rahul, would you like to go first? You were meant to be on this panel, but your travel plans didn't allow you to do that. So let me give you your pride of place.
It's very kind of you, Chand. No, but listen, I didn't want to introduce anything new, but I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One was something very interesting that Harish talked of, which was the PPP model, which is in fact, the model going forward that the government seems to have adopted for infrastructure projects, right? And there are two episodes, pretty dark episodes that come to mind. One was in the mid to late 90s, which was the Enron case in Maharashtra, if you remember, where the Maharashtra government, having signed contracts, completely changed the rules of the game by severely driving down the tariffs, right? And that thing went to seed, but fortunately Enron completely exploded. And perhaps, in the global consciousness, this thing got swept, swept away. The one which is nearest to me, which I find absolutely shocking, was, and Ranu Mama would know this, is this whole episode around the DND, a little thing called the DND Expressway, which had a 30-year contract, but which on popular appeal, the Supreme Court, or was it the Delhi High Court, held that, the venture had made quite enough money, and therefore it needed to revert back to the public domain, and which is quite insane, actually. So there are some really, really poor examples, which if I were an investor through this model, I would seriously worry about, and there is no reason right now to feel confident that the mood of the courts and the mood of the government cannot change, okay? So that is one. So I kind of put a caution to that. The second observation I'd like to make is on the topic that Gautu talked about, and by the way, I'm in complete agreement with what he said. And the observation that I have is, it's my experience that in India, private entrepreneurs, and I just don't mean startup, I also mean existing industrial houses in general. And again, I don't mean the ITCs, etc. I mean the promoter-driven kind of companies, have a fundamental reluctance in deploying or investing their own personal money in projects, unless they have the inside track on something, which basically drives the behavior of trying to get in with the government in significant ways, okay? Because that's how they get the inside track and the sure thing advantages. But in general, they like to borrow, or they like to deploy public money, or in the case of startups, by the way, where people, approach the whole thing with ideas with very little cash in their pocket, they will go for PEs and, and venture capitalists eventually, and so on and so forth. But there is a general reluctance of private entrepreneurs to invest large sums of their own money, especially in manufacturing. I don't know why that is the case, but that is a psychology. So there is a reluctance for domestic capital, right? Promoter capital to come to the table, which is why overseas capital infusions become extremely, extremely important, and everything that Gautu says becomes doubly important. Because for the kind of capital that this country needs to grow and do justice to itself in the future, overseas capital has a huge role to play. Okay, and and again, for several of the reasons that Gautam mentioned and Madhu mentioned, I don't believe the climate is right to attract that kind of capital in such a significant way.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go to the RBI folks. I think Vishu Chacha has put up a lot of questions. Shriti, Amar, and so we have an RBI triumvirate here. Madhu talked about the Vikram and Vetal and how RBI is the Vetal sitting on the banks and causing problems. So Vishu Chacha, would you like to share your point of view, or Amar, anybody, or both of you? Vishu Chacha, are you there?
I think he's not online then.
All right, Amar.
I'm there.
Okay, so please share your thoughts on. You had some comments.
I had a few questions.
Yeah.
One is, let me say about this bad bank thing. Firstly, I think it's quite perverse to call a bad bank ab initio, even before it's been set up. From a regulator's perspective, I find this term most objectionable. But having said that, I find that the need for a bad bank is questionable on two counts. Firstly, what is it? It's actually going to be an ARC. We already have 28 ARCs in the country. I'm happy. I happen to chair the boards of one of them, which is a major ARC. And ever since 2010, they have been growing very significantly. Like, for instance, the ARC whose board I chair, in 2010, they had an AUM of just 77 crores. Today, they have an AUM of 11,000 crores.
Okay.
ARCs, by and large, they are doing well. So there is no gap as such for picking up NPAs. So why should there be a bad bank, and that too a bad bank owned by the public, by the banks themselves?
Right.
So there is an inherent moral hazard here, a conflict of interest, that those who are the equity holders of an institution are also the sellers to that institution. You see, so it's a contradiction in terms. I think a bad bank is a bad idea.
Okay.
And it's quite unnecessary. That is one. Now, as far as the privatization of banks is concerned, actually, here also one has to consider that why should one privatize the public sector banks at all? Is it necessary? How is it going to help? What is ailing the public sector banks? Madhu mentioned two Betals. One of them was Reserve Bank of India, and the other one is Government of India, the Department of Financial Services.
Correct.
Now, Betal is actually a dead body possessed by an evil spirit. Okay. But I would choose not to call the Reserve Bank as a dead body or possessed by an evil spirit. You need a regulator in the market to have some semblance of order. And you have many strict regulators in the world, like Monetary Authority of Singapore or the US Fed or the Bank of England. I mean, they are much tougher than the Reserve Bank of India. So all that I'm saying is that Reserve Bank is necessary, but yes, if you want to improve the governance in banks, if you want better quality of assets, they have to be freed from government control.
Okay.
Government is the owner, but I've seen the government's participation in the boards of these banks, and very often they call the shots. And
Okay.
yes, often phone lending also has been a cause for the burgeoning of NPAs in banks. So I don't think privatization of banks is really the solution. It's not going to solve any problem. So
Okay.
these are the 2 points that I wanted to make.
Thanks. I want to go to Veena Bua. Veena Bua, you wanted to share some perspective. Go ahead, please.
I don't know whether I want to share. It's a mixture of perspective as well as questions.
Yeah.
What always has disturbed me, or rather the question in my mind, is what are we wanting from the growth that we are looking for, you see. So the perspectives that have come out from various speakers, Gatu, Harish, and all, they've talked about the social sector. Harish talked about the digital divide hampering the benefit from going to the lower section. Gautam also talked about the SMEs not benefiting, and also that the top 20% will be benefiting from the policies that are there. We also talked about the trust deficits. We also talked about the farm laws. Now, what all is happening in all these areas, which are the core issues for any economy to deliver good to the nation? I would put it like that. So there is the social aspect, there is the growth aspect, and also I would say the implementation aspect, which is very, very important, because as you yourself said, that there are so many promises made, but delivery has not happened. In the sphere of SMEs, it was right in the beginning, it was said that within a few months, single window will come. But when I hear panel discussions on the TV, on the channels, the SMEs are not happy. They still find a lot of obstacles there for them to have an entry point, how to perform. So why are we gloating over the fact that private sector has been given a status? I wonder if it is more verbal, because the top 20%, as Gautam mentioned, have come to the fore, and there is prospect of growth there. But whether it will penetrate down to the common man, which is the larger section of the population, and deliver. So that is what disturbs me. Okay. I wonder if people can be still very optimistic on that point and can be looking to this government to deliver. That is my question.
Yeah. I want to move to Namita. Namita, on education, I wanted your specific comments. Is there a case, we keep hearing about government schools and how outcomes are not getting delivered, and therefore, the need to include other sectors, other actors to improve outcomes. Your thoughts on that, because this is very fundamental. Education and healthcare delivery is really the responsibility of the government.
That's right. I'd like to say 2 or 3 things over here, and I had flagged some questions and comments in the chat box as well. And, many of my questions are addressed to Harish here, because I agree with him. He's flagged the digital divide. He says that the access to the poor is almost non-existent. The WhatsApp class in the government schools, if we take Delhi as a case in point, which is urban, metropolitan, and you still have smartphones, etc., that's a joke. Everybody knows what teaching and learning is all about. Now, Chand, you talked about things like Byju's and all that. That penetration has been only in the elite and made them super elite. And even if you look at you saw what the government schools have done is they've selected some videos from Byju's, and they've actually sent it to the government school children on WhatsApp. But the accent and all is so American, and it's so sort of convoluted in the kind of English, which is not English as a second language understood by government school children. So the whole purpose is that, we are the elite, you are the dregs, we are doing this to you. So a charity kind of approach is what public-private partnership is ending up doing. So Rukmini Banerjee from Pratham, or the Center Square Foundation, with no offense meant to Harish at all. I'm talking about Ashish Dhawan. I mean, I know them personally, and I've interacted because we are Delhi University and we interact with these people. They are the ones who are telling us that the state has failed, the government has failed, but they are the ones who take all the state patronage, they take all the state funds, but they don't serve the interests of the state. It's one thing to do assessments and say children don't learn. It's one thing to say that children don't have access, but what have they done? The pandemic has been on for a whole year. It's going to continue. Online classes will continue for a good part of this year as well. The new academic session has just started. What has PPP as a model done for this? Education is a fundamental right. It's very convenient to stand up and say the government has to deliver the public good or the public service. But the point is, if government has declared PPP and it has given you the opportunity and you are designing the curricula, you're designing the, the way forward, you're strategizing the experiments and bringing them up to scale, you're inviting Esther Duflo and characters like that to do the research, etc. for you, then you also have a responsibility to address the digital divide, to tell the government school children, to tell the migrant workers' children who are holed up and stuck for lack of resources, how things can move for them as well.
Great.
After all, education is a fundamental. That is why, because the Babus can't envision this, they hire such people to do it for them. But what have we done?
So
or are we even thinking
Harish,
of this?
I'd like you to comment. What is your point of view on this?
In my experience, I think your initial starting conditions, right, at the beginning of anything dictate where you reach, right? What are our initial starting conditions? Our initial starting conditions are, I work extensively in one state where I know 30% of the schools don't have electricity, 40% of the schools don't have boundary walls, and there is 25% teacher shortage. Those are initial conditions, right? There is a deep learning loss, and we've all been through these ASER data, and I don't want to repeat it. So the challenge is that I think that we have as a country, let multiple agendas control our education discourse, right? But I mean, there has been a deliberate hollowing out of the healthcare and the education systems so that low quality, low outcome focused private players have been allowed to thrive in these systems. You said, Chand Bhai Sahab, that government school outcomes are poor. Well, reality is that private school outcomes are equally poor, in fact, doubly so, because not only do they deliver poor educational outcomes, they also cost an arm and a leg and then some to a person who can't afford it. So the reality is that and all the questions that Namita Jiji are asked are correct. The question is, should we be asking these questions 70 years down? I mean, every time somebody says today, I mean, I work with governments. I mean, really, the rot starts at the top. We have principal secretaries at a state level who have never touched the education sector before, right? They come in 2 years, right? They have babus under them. I can tell you, I am an EdTech advisor to one of the states, to 2 states. They don't even do review meetings, right? How does your education go up when you are not reviewing, right? When primary school has 40% excess teachers, and in a state like, say, Bihar, secondary school, there is one teacher for 2,500, one English teacher for 2,500 students in Bihar, right? So these are not things that NGO sector can resolve. Ultimately, the resource allocation is the government's responsibility, not small private NGO sectors. And if the government is getting influenced by these NGO sectors, that's because the government lacks people who have enough depth of experience in the field to carry the day, neither in conception nor in execution. So essentially, we are doing stuck-up, cut-paste models of various countries because we don't have anybody who has spent enough time in the furnace trying to perfect the sword.
Okay. Shantanu, I wanted to invite you to join this debate because you, having held senior positions in government, and I know you're associated now with the DPS schools, would you like to comment on the state of education, which is, foundational, as we all know? Shantanu? You're on mute. Unmute. Yeah, Shantanu, now we can
No,
hear
I
you.
was just saying that my experience of 36 years has been widespread, so I would not like to restrict myself only to the education sector. I've heard these very, very enlightening comments. I have just 3 or 4 things to say. One is that India's history has been a long history of missing the bus. For some reason or the other, we keep declaring that in spite of our best intentions, we've missed the bus. And the way things are going, we will continue to miss the bus. I totally agree with the analysis of Gautam and with a lot of very, very valid points which have been made by Harish. The sort of setup that we have here, how do we expect private investment from abroad to come in? Land acquisition is a problem. Power is a problem. Our policies are not long-term policies. We keep reverting on them. Our labor laws need modification. So these are some issues which have to be tackled. Another point which I would like to bring to everyone's notice, because it has, I think, missed some of us. What is the sort of regime in which the private sector can flourish? Enlightened despotism? Perhaps yes. An authoritarian regime, which perhaps we are seeing now, or it is developing in some way, which will give rise to crony capitalism, full stop. Or a truly democratic liberal setup with very clear laws, very firm laws, in which everybody gets an equal opportunity to start the industry. So this is something also which we should take a look at, because in spite of all our pious hopes, if the leadership and the form of government that we have does not give respect and does not give support to these sort of institutions and organizations, I think our recovery will take a very, very long time. It is taking a long time because of this. So in keeping in view what Harish had said, I would say this government should increasingly restrict itself to its basic duties: education, health, drinking water. Let 1,000 flowers bloom at the grassroots level and let the government support them. And for heaven's sake, stay out of those areas where you don't have too much to contribute. If you want to contribute, listen to those people, listen to their ideas, and support them. I think that's all that I have to say. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. Ranu Chacha, you had put your hand up. As we are sort of ending, I'm mindful that it's 7:30, so we've already, I think, consumed a lot of our time, but maybe to you now, and then we'll wrap up in the next 5-7 minutes.
Okay, so the first 30 seconds I want to devote to Rahul about the Noida toll bridge example that he took of the PPP, the project. Rahul, it was a very unequal contract. There was an agreement which I'm very well aware of because I knew the guy in charge of the project, and that was that the lease would hand over back to the government will happen when a 16% return on investment has happened. And the books were cooked. And I know this from the horse's mouth, so that 16%, which would have happened many years ago, was just delayed because the books were cooked. So I'm sorry that contract was cancelled because it was a crooked contract. And the person in charge of the company, the overall in charge of the company, I was with him in the London School of Economics when he was talking, and he took the first statement was, I do not invest in any project unless it's likely to get bankrupt in the first year. And this was
well said.
Okay, right.
His logic was, I will do this loss-making project because using that as a template, I will do many, many such projects all over India. And that organization, which everybody knows about, on the basis of the Noida toll bridge, developed a road portfolio of 9,000 kilometers, which then eventually became their most valuable corporate within the 300 odd companies that they had. So this was just a short example of the Noida toll bridge, but this brings me to PPP in infrastructure. I have been exposed, I guess, the most over here to infrastructure PPPs. And I absolutely agree that this is not going to happen. The capital is not going to come. What Gautam says is absolutely right. That this is primarily because there is distrust, there is confrontational attitude between the public and the private, between the government and the private sector. Wherever I go and wherever I have been and done projects overseas, there is huge collaboration because mutual interest is understood. If you were going to accuse the private sector of being cronies or somehow, then you have to accuse the government of being corrupt. Neither of the cases is true. Neither of the cases is true. There are a few exceptions and bad apples, certainly, but I have not seen in all my years of doing infrastructure projects in this country now for about 25 years, this collaboration between government and private sector, which is frowned upon in case it is misunderstood, has happened. I do. And this collaboration in the national interest is so critical. But what happens is that ground rules keep on changing under the feet of the investor once he invests. The goalpost keeps on changing. And it's not going to come. There is no shortage of capital. There is no shortage of opportunity in India. But India always remains the land of opportunity and capital doesn't come.
Okay, so on that note, I just want to sort of wrap up this evening's discussion. And so it would appear that the jury is still out on, whether the private sector can actually power the economy, as it were, because there seems to be a trust deficit it's evident in the farmer agitation, and I think there has been some talk about crony capitalism as well. I just want to add tongue-in-cheek that in the latest list of billionaires, the highest growth has been Gautam Adani's. He's added $16 billion to his value. And interestingly, the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad has a Reliance Ambani end and a Adani end. And I think that is something that, doesn't create great optics. So, having said all that, I think the intent, hopefully this time, is a lot stronger, and only time will tell whether it is going to be backed by implementation actions on the ground. And the clock is already ticking, and let's see how the whole thing unfolds. So thank you everybody for your patient hearing. It's 7:37 p.m. And I want to hand back to Ranu Chacha to close this session and introduce perhaps the next session, the final session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I have to compliment you because this is the first session that has actually stuck to a schedule and it has moved along very nicely. So very well done, Chand and Gautam and Harish and Madhu. I really enjoyed this discussion. And I think the rest of the audience did. I did not see too much attrition at the end of it. So it was apparent, it was interesting to everybody. So as I normally do, I will announce the last session of the series 1, which is going to be led by Madhur. And this will be on ecosystem restoration, which will be on the 18th of April. And this is a topic that concerns all of us, and all of us have our own opinions about this, but everybody sort of agrees that something has to be done. So we will learn about what needs to be done in that session. I also have to say that that will be the last session of FTG for 4 months, because we need to sort of regroup. We need to strategize again on how season 2 will look like. And I think, as you said, somebody said, absence makes the heart grow fonder. So basically, we're going to give it a break. And so thank you so much. This was great. And all the best to everybody. Thank you for attending and wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great session.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for the
you.
session. Thank you.
Gautam.